Subscribe to Storylab. Now, let's begin this one. The workshop smelled of cedar and varnish, familiar scents that usually brought Edward Case comfort. Tonight, they did nothing to calm the tremor in his hands as he stood in his late wife's closet, staring at the small gap he'd just discovered behind the baseboard. 9 months. 9 months since Lillian had died in their bedroom, her body finally giving up after weeks of what the doctors called a lupus flare-up. 9 months since his world had shattered, leaving him alone to raise their 6-year-old son Perry in a house that still smelled like her lavender soap. "Daddy, Mommy came to my room last night." Perry had said it so matter-of-factly at breakfast between bites of cereal. Edward had felt his heart crack a little more, recognizing the desperate logic of a grieving child's mind trying to make sense of loss. "It was just a dream, honey," he'd replied, forcing steadiness into his voice. "No." Perry had shaken his head with absolute certainty. "She told me to check her closet, behind the wooden part at the bottom. She said you needed to know the truth." The words had echoed in Edward's mind all day as he worked in his furniture workshop, handcrafting a dining table for a client. By evening, he couldn't resist. He'd thought finding nothing would at least give him closure, proof that it was just Perry's imagination trying to keep his mother alive. But there was something behind the baseboard. Edward's fingers found the gap and pulled. The board came away easily, too easily. Lillian had loosened it deliberately. Behind it, a waterproof document bag held a small digital recorder, a USB drive, a leather journal, and a sealed envelope with his name written in her distinctive handwriting. His hand shook as he opened the envelope. The letter inside was dated 3 days before she died. "My dearest Edward, if you're reading this, it means I didn't survive, and I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for not telling you sooner, but I needed to be sure, and I was terrified of being wrong. I'm not wrong. They're killing me. I know how insane that sounds. The doctors say it's lupus. My blood work shows lupus markers. But lupus doesn't explain everything, and I've been documenting symptoms that don't fit. 6 weeks ago, I started feeling worse after every dinner at Chad and Tiffany's house. Every single time. So I started paying attention. I found thallium in my system. Edward, I had my blood tested privately. Someone's been poisoning me, slowly, carefully, in doses small enough to mimic a lupus flare." Edward's vision blurred. He read the words again, unable to process them. Chad Wilson had been his best friend since college. They'd started their business together, Edward designing and building custom furniture, Chad handling the business side and client relationships. Tiffany had been a fixture in their lives for 5 years. "I didn't want to believe it either," the letter continued, "but I kept investigating. The recorder has conversations I captured. The USB has documents I found in Chad's office. He's been embezzling from your business for over a year, Edward. More than that, he and Tiffany have been running a real estate fraud scheme with that lawyer friend of his, Damon McMillan. They're stealing from wealthy clients, manipulating property deals, taking money that should go to renovations. I confronted Chad 2 weeks ago. I told him I knew about the embezzlement, that I was going to the police. He laughed it off, said I was paranoid from the lupus medication. But the poisoning got worse after that. I think Tiffany has access to thallium through her uncle's pest control company. I think they decided I was too much of a risk. I've been too weak to go to the police myself, and I'm terrified they'll just discredit me as a sick woman with paranoid delusions. The evidence is all here. The journal has everything I documented: dates, symptoms, timeline. The USB has financial records I copied from Chad's computer. The recorder has conversations where they discuss the fraud. I'm leaving this for you because I trust you to know what to do. Be careful, my love. They're dangerous. But more than that, they're arrogant. They think they're smarter than everyone else. I love you and Perry more than anything. Take care of our son, and make them pay. Forever yours, Lillian." Edward sat on the closet floor, the letter clutched in his hands, and finally let himself feel the rage he'd been suppressing for 9 months. All that grief, all that loss, it hadn't been fate or disease. It had been murder. Premeditated, calculated murder. His phone was in his hand before he'd made a conscious decision. He dialed 911, his voice surprisingly steady as he reported what he'd found. Detective Terrence Nicholson arrived within the hour, a weathered man in his early 40s with sharp eyes that didn't miss much. He listened to Edward's story, examined the evidence, and made careful notes. "Mr. Case, I need you to understand something," Nicholson said after reviewing the journal. "This is compelling, but it's also complicated. Your wife was sick with a documented autoimmune condition. Her death was ruled natural causes by the medical examiner. Thallium poisoning can be detected in hair samples, but after 9 months. You're saying you can't do anything." Edward's voice was flat. "I'm saying we'll investigate, but building a murder case on evidence collected by the victim before death, without her testimony, is challenging, especially against people with money for good lawyers." Nicholson's expression softened. "But I believe you, Mr. Case, and I'll do everything I can." After Nicholson left with copies of the evidence, Edward sat in his workshop, the original documents still in his possession. The detective's carefully chosen words echoed in his mind. Challenging, complicated, money for good lawyers. Lucas Banks found him there at midnight, surrounded by Lillian's notes spread across his workbench. Lucas had been Edward's friend for 15 years, a general contractor who'd helped build this very workshop. Unlike Chad, Lucas had actually been there in the weeks after Lillian's death, helping with Perry, bringing groceries, asking nothing in return. "Terrence called me," Lucas said quietly, letting himself in through the workshop side door. "Told me what you found." "I'm so damn sorry, Ed." Edward looked up, and Lucas saw something in his friend's eyes that made him pause. Not just grief anymore. Purpose. They killed her, Lucas. They poisoned her, and they got away with it because everyone thought it was just her lupus getting worse. Edward's hands were steady now as he picked up Lillian's journal. "The police will investigate, but Nicholson but said there's not enough to guarantee a conviction. Chad and Tiffany will lawyer up, destroy evidence, create reasonable doubt. So what are you going to do?" Edward was quiet for a long moment, his mind already working through possibilities. He'd spent 9 months in a fog of grief, barely functioning beyond taking care of Perry and keeping his business afloat. But Lillian had been right about one thing in her letter. Chad and Tiffany were arrogant. They thought they were smarter than everyone else. "I'm going to give the police every chance to do this the right way," Edward said finally. "But I'm also going to do what Lillian couldn't. I'm going to investigate to understand exactly what they did and why. And if the system fails," he met Lucas's eyes, "then I'll make sure they pay anyway." Lucas nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "First, I need you to help me understand the real estate fraud Lillian mentioned. You work in construction. You know how these deals work. Second, I need to act normal around Chad. He can't know I found this." "That's going to be hard," Lucas said. "You've barely spoken to him in months." I blamed myself for not being able to save her. It made sense that I'd pull away. Edward stood, gathering Lillian's evidence carefully. "But now I need to get close again. I need to understand exactly how deep this goes and who else is involved." Over the next week, Detective Nicholson worked quietly, but Edward could see the investigation was moving slowly. Medical examiners were reluctant to second-guess a months-old diagnosis. The financial records Lillian had copied were concerning, but not definitively criminal without proper forensic accounting. The recorded conversations were ambiguous, careful people being careful with their words. Meanwhile, Edward began his own investigation. He started having coffee with Chad again, citing a therapist's advice about not isolating himself from friends. Chad was sympathetic, warm even, expressing concern for Edward's well-being. The ease of his lies was stunning. "I'm glad you're reaching out," Chad said during one of their meetings at a downtown cafe. "Tiffany and I have been worried about you. We know how much you love Lillian." Edward forced a sad smile, watching Chad's face for any sign of guilt. There was nothing but practiced sympathy. "I'm trying to move forward. For Perry's sake. That's healthy, man. Really healthy." Chad leaned forward. "Actually, I've been meaning to talk to you about the business. We've got some opportunities coming up, high-end clients looking for custom work. Could be good for you to dive into a big project, keep your mind occupied." "Maybe," Edward said carefully. "What kind of projects?" As Chad described potential jobs, Edward listened with new understanding. These weren't just furniture commissions. They were part of the larger fraud scheme Lillian had discovered. Chad would bring in wealthy clients, Edward would create custom pieces, and somewhere in the inflated project costs and complex billing, money was being siphoned off. Edward had been so focused on his craft, so trusting, that he'd never questioned the business side. That was Chad's domain. What a perfect arrangement for a thief. That evening, Edward met Lucas at a diner across town, away from anywhere they might be recognized. "I've been looking into the real estate deals Lillian documented," Lucas said, sliding a folder across the table. "Your friend Chad is involved in at least 6 major property renovations in the last 2 years. On paper, they're high-end flips, buy old mansions, renovate them, sell to wealthy buyers. But look at these numbers." Edward studied the documents. The renovation costs are inflated. Massively. I know what materials cost, what labor costs. These budgets are padded by 30, sometimes 40%. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars per property just disappearing. Into whose pockets? That's where Damon McMillan comes in. Lucas pulled out another document. He's the lawyer who structures these deals, creates shell companies, manages the transactions. I reached out to a buddy who works in real estate law. He says McMillan has a reputation. Not openly dirty, but the kind of guy who knows how to make money move in ways that are hard to trace. Edward felt the pieces clicking together. So Chad brings in the clients and the projects. McMillan creates the legal structure to hide the theft, and Tiffany. I'm still working on her role, but I found something interesting. Lucas showed him a business registration. She runs an interior design consultation business. Guess who she consults for on these renovation projects? All of them. All of them. And her fees are also inflated. She's getting paid $50,000, $60,000 per property for design consultation. I talked to some actual interior designers. That's 3 times the going rate. Edward sat back, the scope of the fraud becoming clear. It wasn't just embezzlement from his business. It was a full criminal enterprise using multiple avenues to steal from wealthy clients who would never notice the inflated costs among the millions they were spending. And Lillian had discovered it all. She must have recognized the pattern, Edward said quietly. She worked in interior design. She would have known Tiffany's fees were absurd, and she had access to our business accounts, so she could see the discrepancies there too. The question is, what are you going to do with this information? Edward looked at his friend, thinking of Lillian's final letter. They're arrogant. They think they're smarter than everyone else. I'm going to use it against them, he said. But I need more than just financial records. I need to prove they killed her, and need to trap them so thoroughly that they can't lie their way out. Ow! A plan was forming in Edward's mind, dangerous and precise. By giving them exactly what they want, a chance to steal even more, we're going to create the perfect score for them. Something so tempting they can't resist. And while they're busy committing new crimes, I'll be documenting everything. Lucas was quiet for a moment. This is risky, Ed. These people already killed once. I know. Edward's voice was steel. That's why I need to be smarter than them. That's why I need to make absolutely sure that when they fall hard enough that they never get up. He thought of Perry sleeping safely at home with a babysitter, dreaming of a mother who'd loved him enough to hide the truth where it would eventually be found. Thought of Lillian spending her final weeks in pain and fear, knowing she was dying but still fighting to leave justice behind. They wanted to get away with murder. Edward was going to make sure that didn't happen, even if he had to build the trap himself, piece by careful piece, the way he built everything else in his life, with patience, precision, and absolute commitment to the finished product. Detective Nicholson called 3 weeks after Edward had given him the evidence. His tone was carefully neutral. "Mr. Case, I wanted to update you on the investigation. We've consulted with the DA's office. The financial irregularities your wife documented are concerning, and we've opened an inquiry into Mr. Wilson's business practices. However, you can't prove murder," Edward finished. "We exhumed your wife's body." Nicholson's voice was heavy. There were trace amounts of thallium in the hair samples, but the medical examiner says it's not definitive. Could be from environmental exposure, old rat poison in the house, any number of sources, combined with her documented lupus, and the fact that she'd been treating with immunosuppressants that can have similar symptoms to low-level thallium exposure. A good defense attorney would tear it apart. Edward had expected this, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. So they're going to walk. The financial investigation is ongoing. We might be able to build a fraud case, get them on embezzlement or conspiracy. But murder? Nicholson sighed. I'm sorry. I believe your wife was right about what happened to her. But belief isn't enough in court. After he hung up, Edward sat in his workshop, Lillian's journal open in front of him. She'd known this might happen. That's why her final words had been make them pay, not let the police handle it. His phone buzzed with a text from Chad. Got a big opportunity to discuss. Dinner at our place Friday. Tiffany's making that pasta you love. Edward stared at the message, rage burning cold in his chest. They'd poisoned Lillian at dinners just like this one, sitting across the table with warm smiles while they slowly killed her. He typed back, "Sound great. I'll bring wine." Lucas arrived at the workshop an hour later, finding Edward surrounded by blueprints and sketches, but these weren't furniture designs. They were plans. "I'm in," Lucas said without preamble. "Whatever you need." Lillian was good people, and Perry deserves justice for his mother. "This might get messy," Edward warned. "What I'm planning, it's not exactly legal." Lucas pulled up a stool. "Then we better make sure we don't get caught. Show me what you've got." Edward spread out the documents he'd been organizing. Chad's pattern is clear. He targets clients with more money than sense. People who want prestige properties but don't understand construction costs. He finds old estates that need work, brings in Damon to structure the deals, then systematically overcharges for everything. And Tiffany validates it with her design consultancy. Right. They work as a team, and they've gotten away with it because they're stealing from people who can afford to lose it and don't pay close attention. Edward pulled out a property listing he'd found. But what if we gave him a target that was too good to resist? A client with unlimited money, no construction knowledge, and a project so big the potential take would be in the millions. Lucas's eyes widened. You want to bait them. More than that. I want to create a situation where they have to commit their crimes in ways I can document. Where they're so focused on the score that they don't realize I'm watching every move. Edward's finger traced over the property listing. A historic mansion in disrepair, the kind of project that could legitimately cost millions to renovate. We create a fake buyer, someone with deep pockets who wants the full treatment. Custom furniture, complete interior redesign, the works. Where are you going to get the money to make this believable? I'm not. We're going to make them think there's money. Damon creates shell companies and fake documentation all the time. We're going to do the same thing, but in reverse. A shell company that looks wealthy, references that check out, bank accounts with just enough balance to pass initial scrutiny. Lucas whistled low. That's fraud, Ed. So, this is what they did to Lillian. Edward's voice was hard. The difference is we're going to make sure the only people who get hurt are the ones who deserve it. Once they commit to the scam, once they start stealing from our fake client, we document everything. And then, he pulled out another folder. We don't just go to the police. We go to every client they've ever defrauded. We expose the entire operation, show the pattern. One victim's word is questionable. 20 victims with documented proof of systematic fraud. That's a federal case. And the murder charge? Edward's expression darkened. That's where it gets complicated. I need something more than just Lillian's evidence. I need them to slip up, to reveal something they couldn't know unless they'd done it. And I think I know how to make that happen. He explained his plan, and Lucas listened with growing amazement and concern. This is dangerous, Lucas said when Edward finished. If they even suspect what you're doing, they won't. I'm going to be the grieving widower who's finally ready to move on, who trusts his old friend to help him rebuild his life. I'm going to be exactly what they want me to be. Edward's hands clenched. Until the moment I'm not. Friday dinner at the Wilsons' house was exactly as Edward remembered. Tiffany playing the gracious hostess, Chad the concerned friend. The pasta was excellent, the wine flowed freely, and the conversation was warm. Edward played his part perfectly, talking about Perry's progress in first grade, about slowly getting back into his woodworking with real passion. He mentioned feeling ready to take on bigger projects again. That's great to hear, man, Chad said, refilling Edward's wine glass. Because I've actually got something perfect for you. Remember how I mentioned those high-end clients? Well, there's this guy, real estate investor from California, looking to renovate a historic property outside the city. Wants custom everything, built-ins, furniture, the full artisan treatment. Budget's basically unlimited. Sounds ambitious, Edward said carefully. It is, but it's exactly the kind of showcase piece that could put your work in front of serious money. I'd handle the business side like always. You focus on creating something incredible. Chad leaned forward. What do you say? Ready to get back in the game? Edward pretended to consider, letting hope and hesitation play across his face. I don't know, Chad. Big projects mean big commitments. With Perry, it's been 9 months, Ed. Tiffany's voice was gentle, sympathetic. Lillian wouldn't want you putting your life on hold forever. She'd want you to thrive. The audacity of it. Invoking Lillian's name while sitting in the same room where they'd planned her death. Nearly broke Edward's composure. But he held it together, nodding slowly. You're right. She would. He raised his glass. Okay, I'm in. Tell me about this project. As Chad outlined the details, Edward listened carefully, memorizing every word. Because this project, the one Chad thought he was pitching, was about to become something very different. It was about to become the trap that would destroy them all. The mansion was perfect, a crumbling Victorian estate on 12 acres. Exactly the kind of white elephant property that attracted ambitious flippers. Edward had found it through Lucas's real estate connections. Foreclosed, bank-owned, available for the right price. But Edward wasn't buying it. His fictional client was. Meet Marcus Hartwell, Lucas said, showing Edward the identity they constructed. Real estate investor from San Diego, made his money in tech before retiring at 40 to flip luxury properties. He's private, doesn't do social media, and his LLC is registered in Delaware. Edward studied the documents, business registration, bank statements showing a balance of $2 million, letters of credit from a California bank. All of it false. All of it created by a friend of Lucas's who specialized in background checks and private investigation. This is illegal, Edward said quietly. Yep, but so is murder. Lucas met his eyes. You still want to do this? Edward thought of Perry asking when Mommy was coming home, of Lillian's handwriting in her final letter, of Chad's easy smile across the dinner table. Yeah, I do. They presented Marcus Hartwell to Chad as a client Edward had connected with through online woodworking forums. A wealthy recluse who wanted a showcase property and had specifically requested Edward's custom work after seeing his portfolio. Chad's eyes had lit up like a kid at Christmas. This is incredible, Ed. This is exactly the kind of client that can transform your business. He was already calculating. Edward could see it. Already figuring out how much he could skim from a project this size. I'll need you to handle the business side, Edward said. Contracts, scheduling, budget. I'm still not great with that stuff. Of course. That's what partners are for. Chad clapped him on the shoulder. Let me bring in Damon to structure the deal, and Tiffany can do the interior design consultation. We'll make this property sing. Perfect. Everyone in place. Over the next 2 weeks, Edward played his role flawlessly. He met with Marcus Hartwell, actually Lucas's investigator friend in disguise, at the property, discussing custom designs with genuine enthusiasm. He brought Chad into the planning meetings, watching as his former friend smoothly inflated every estimate, padding the budget at every opportunity. Damon McMillan drew up contracts that gave Chad control over project finances, creating a structure for theft. Tiffany prepared design proposals with her usual inflated fees. They were doing exactly what they'd done on every previous project. Not realizing this time, their victim was watching every move. Edward documented it all. Hidden cameras in the mansion captured their private conversations. Audio recorders in his workshop picked up Chad's phone calls. Every inflated invoice, every padded estimate, every whispered conference about how much they could skim, it was all being preserved. But the financial fraud was just the beginning. Edward needed more. He needed them to reveal what they'd done to Lillian. The opportunity came 5 weeks into the project at a celebration dinner Chad organized to mark the start of construction. They gathered in an upscale restaurant. Chad, Tiffany, Damon, and his wife Gwen, Edward, and Lucas. Edward had been carefully drinking more at these gatherings, playing the part of man, using alcohol to cope with grief. Tonight, he let himself seem particularly affected, loosening his tongue just enough to be believable. "You know what I miss most?" he said, his words slightly slurred. "The way Lillian used to organize everything. She had this system, labeled everything. Clothes, files, even her medical stuff. She was so meticulous." He saw Tiffany's expression flicker, just for a second, and knew he'd touched a nerve. "She was always organized," Tiffany agreed smoothly. "Remember how she used to catalog all her design projects?" "Yeah." Edward's voice turned maudlin. "I finally went through her things last month. Found all her medical records, her symptom journals. She documented everything those last few months." Chad's hand tightened slightly on his wine glass. "That must have been hard to read." "It was. She was so scared, watching her body fail. She even—" Edward paused, as if uncertain whether to continue. "She even thought someone might be doing it to her. The lupus, I mean. Thought someone was making her sick." The silence that followed was electric. Edward kept his eyes down, as if embarrassed by the admission. "The disease can cause paranoia," Damon said carefully. "When the body's attacking itself, sometimes the mind looks for external explanations." "That's what I figured." Edward finished his drink. "Just the medication talking. But sometimes I wonder, there were things in her notes that were weird. Patterns she saw." "What kind of patterns?" Tiffany's voice was too casual. Edward shrugged. "She thought she felt worse after eating certain places, after being around certain people. But that's crazy, right? I mean, who would want to hurt Lillian?" He looked up, meeting each of their eyes in turn. Chad's face was sympathetic. Tiffany's was concerned. Damon's was unreadable. But Edward had seen enough. The fear was there, buried deep but present. They were wondering what Lillian had written, what she might have suspected, what Edward might have found. Good. Let them wonder. Let them worry. That night, Edward's doorbell rang at midnight. He checked the security camera, recently installed, and saw Tiffany standing on his porch alone. He opened the door cautiously. "Tiffany? Is everything okay? I'm sorry to come so late. I couldn't sleep." She looked genuinely distressed, and Edward might have believed it if he didn't know better. "What you said at dinner about Lillian's journals?" "Edward, I need to know what was in them." "Why?" "Because Lillian was my friend too. If she was scared, if she thought something was wrong." Tiffany's eyes were wet. "I need to know if there was something I missed, some way I could have helped her." Edward let her inside, watching as she played the concerned friend perfectly. If he'd been the grieving widower she thought he was, he'd have been completely taken in. "The journals are mostly medical stuff," he said. "Symptoms, medication schedules. But there were some pages about suspicion she had, about her lupus getting worse." He paused. She thought maybe she was being exposed to something environmental. Mentioned having symptoms after certain dinners. Tiffany's expression didn't change, but Edward saw her swallow. Did she name any specific places?" "A few. Your house was mentioned once or twice." He watched her carefully. "But she also mentioned my house, Lucas's house, the office. Like I said, the doctors said it was probably just paranoia from the medication." "Probably," Tiffany agreed too quickly. "Lupus can cause all kinds of strange symptoms. And the medication she was on, immunosuppressants, can make people paranoid." "That's what I thought." Edward yawned, making a show of tiredness. "Sorry, Tiff. I'm exhausted. Was there something else?" She hesitated, and Edward could practically see the wheels turning. She wanted to know if Lillian had written anything specifically damning, but she couldn't ask directly without revealing her guilt. "No, that's all. I wanted to make sure you weren't torturing yourself with what-ifs." She touched his arm gently. "Lillian's death was a tragedy, but it was natural causes. You need to let yourself accept that and move on." After she left, Edward checked the hidden recorder in his living room, making sure it had caught every word. Then he called Lucas. "They're getting nervous," he said. "We need to accelerate the timeline." "What happened?" Edward told him about Tiffany's late-night visit. "They're worried about what Lillian wrote. That means they know there was something to write about. We need them to make a mistake, do something that proves their involvement." "How?" "By making them think I found something specific. Something that proves murder, but that I'm not sure what to do with." Edward was already planning. "We're going to create evidence that doesn't exist and see how they react. That's risky. Everything about this is risky. But if they think I have proof they killed Lillian and don't know what to do with it, they might try something desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. Lucas was quiet for a moment. You're using yourself as bait. I'm using everything as bait. The mansion project, the money, my apparent grief and confusion. All of it is designed to make them reveal themselves. Edward's voice hardened. They killed my wife and thought they got away with it. I'm going to prove they were wrong. The next day, Edward had a carefully staged conversation with Detective Nicholson at a coffee shop he knew Chad frequented. He'd called Nicholson beforehand, explained the plan, and gotten the detective's reluctant agreement to play along. I think I might have found something, Edward said, loud enough to be overheard by anyone paying attention. In Lillian's things. A test result from a private lab. What kind of test? Nicholson played his part well, leaning forward with interest. Toxicology. She had her blood tested 3 weeks before she died. The results show thallium, detective, way above normal levels. Several heads turned at nearby tables. Edward didn't look around, but he knew the gossip would spread. In a city this size, word would get back to Chad within hours. Mr. Case, we should discuss this privately. I don't know what to do with it, Edward continued, his voice carrying just the right note of distress. Is it enough? Can we finally prove what happened to her? Nicholson's response was quiet, drawing Edward in, so their conversation became private. But the damage was done. The seed was planted. Edward went home and waited. He didn't have to wait long. That evening, his workshop alarm triggered. Someone was trying to break in through the back door. Edward watched on his security camera as a figure in dark clothes worked at the lock. Amateur hour. Likely looking for Lillian's evidence. He called 911, then Lucas. Someone's breaking into my workshop. Don't go out there. I'm not. I'm watching on camera. But I want this on record. Edward stayed on the phone with the operator, describing the break-in as it happened. The intruder got the door open, entered the workshop, went straight for the file cabinet where Edward kept his business records. The police arrived within minutes, catching the intruder still inside. Edward came out of the house as they made the arrest, recognizing the figure immediately. It was Jerome Wilder, Tiffany's cousin, a man with a criminal record for burglary who'd always been on the periphery of their social circle. I don't understand, Edward said to the responding officer. Why would Jerome break into my workshop? But he understood perfectly. They'd sent someone expendable to find and destroy the evidence they thought Edward had found. Someone who could be disavowed if caught. At the police station, Jerome initially claimed it was just a random burglary. But Nicholson, working off the information Edward had been feeding him, pressed harder. Funny coincidence that you chose to rob the workshop of a man whose wife was murdered 9 months ago. Funnier still that you went straight for the file cabinet instead of taking tools you could have fenced. Jerome's lawyer shut down the questioning, but the message was clear. They knew Edward was onto them, and they were trying to cover their tracks. Which meant it was time for Edward to spring the real trap. The Marcus Hartwell renovation project moved into full swing. Edward threw himself into the custom furniture designs with genuine passion, creating pieces that showcased his true skill. Because even though the client was fake and the project was a trap, the craftsmanship was real. It was important that his work be real. It was one of the things that separated him from people like Chad. Edward built things that lasted, while Chad just built lies. The mansion was beautiful, in its way. High ceilings, original molding, the kind of architectural details that modern construction never bothered with anymore. As Edward worked on a custom library, built-in shelves in cherry wood with hand-carved details, he could almost forget this was all an elaborate sting operation. Chad visited frequently, always with some new invoice or budget adjustment. Edward approved everything, playing the part of the artist too focused on his craft to worry about finances. What Chad didn't know was that every invoice was being analyzed by a forensic accountant Lucas had hired. Every inflated cost, every padded expense, every shell company payment. It was all being documented in detail. 2 months into the project, they had enough evidence to prosecute Chad, Tiffany, and Damon for fraud on the Hartwell project alone. Combined with the evidence Lillian had gathered on the previous schemes, they had a pattern of systematic criminal enterprise. But Edward still didn't have murder. That changed when Damon McMillan made a mistake. It happened during a site meeting at the mansion. Edward was showing Chad and Damon the progress on the main staircase restoration when Damon's phone rang. He stepped away to take the call, and Edward, with hidden recording equipment running, moved closer. "I don't care what Jerome said to the police," Damon was saying, his voice tight. "He keeps his mouth shut, or he goes down alone. We had an agreement. No, the thallium source is long gone. We cleaned that up months ago when... Just handle it." He turned and found Edward standing there, apparently absorbed in examining the staircase. Damon's expression was carefully neutral as he ended the call. "Sorry about that. Client issue. No problem." Edward ran his hand along the restored banister. "This wood is original. Over 100 years old. You can tell by the grain pattern, the way it's aged." He looked up at Damon. "Funny thing about things that last. They leave traces. Evidence of everything that touched them, every change they went through." Damon's smile was thin. "That's poetic. It's just observation. My whole job is paying attention to details other people miss." Edward held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "Everything leaves traces if you know where to look." After they left, Edward reviewed the recording. Damon's words were ambiguous enough that a good lawyer might explain them away, but combined with everything else, they were damning. He'd mentioned thallium. He'd referenced Jerome keeping quiet. He'd implied cleaning up evidence. It was another piece of the puzzle, but Edward needed more. He needed them to directly confess, or to make a move so obvious there could be no other explanation. That night, Perry had another dream. Mommy came again. He told Edward at breakfast. She said, "You're doing good." She said to be careful. Edward pulled his son into a hug, fighting back the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. What else did she say? That the bad people will try to hurt you like they hurt her. But you're smarter than them. Perry looked up with absolute faith in his eyes. "You are smarter, right, Daddy?" "I'm trying to be, buddy. I'm trying to be." Lucas found Edward in the workshop that afternoon, surrounded by his notes and recordings. "We've got enough for the fraud case. Multiple felonies, potential federal charges. They're going to prison Ed. But not for murder. Maybe murder can't be proven. Maybe we have to accept." "No." Edward's voice was hard. "Lillian knew they killed her. She documented it. I found the evidence she left for exactly this reason. I'm not going to let them get away with it just because the legal system has a high burden of proof." "What are you planning?" Edward pulled out a new recording, one he'd made the previous week. "Remember how I said we needed them to make a mistake? To do something that revealed their guilt? I think I know how to make that happen." He played the recording, a conversation between him and Chad, where Edward had casually mentioned finding more of Lillian's things, including a video she'd recorded on her laptop weeks before she died. A video where she talked about her suspicions. "That video doesn't exist," Lucas said. "I know, but they don't." Edward's expression was grim. "I mentioned I was debating whether to give it to the police, that I was worried it would just seem like the paranoid ramblings of a sick woman. I said I was keeping it somewhere safe while I decided what to do. And you think they'll try to find it? I think they'll be desperate to find it. Because if Lillian named them on video, even if she was wrong about why, it establishes that she suspected them before she died. It gives context to all her other evidence." Edward pulled up the security system on his computer. "So I'm going to give them a chance to look." The plan was simple but dangerous. Edward announced he was taking Perry to visit Lillian's parents for the weekend, his first trip away since her death. He made sure Chad knew he'd be gone, that the house would be empty. Then he and Lucas set up cameras everywhere, in the house, in the workshop, covering every angle. And they waited. The break-in happened on Saturday night. Edward watched from his laptop at a hotel across town as a car pulled up to his dark house. Chad and Tiffany got out, using a key Edward hadn't known they had, probably copied during one of their many dinner visits. They moved through the house efficiently, clearly looking for something specific. Edward's bedroom first, searching through drawers and closets. Then Lillian's old office, which Edward had left largely untouched. Where would he keep it? Tiffany's voice came through clearly on the audio feed. Edward's sentimental. He wouldn't throw anything of hers away. Chad was rifling through file boxes. Check her computer again. Already checked. The video's not on it. Then he moved it. maybe to his workshop. They headed outside, and Edward felt his pulse quicken. This was it. They were on camera, breaking into his home, searching for evidence they believed incriminated them in murder. Even if they didn't find anything, especially if they didn't find anything, their actions were damning. In the workshop, they grew more frantic. Chad found the file cabinet where Edward kept Lillian's journals and evidence. She always was too smart for her own good, Chad muttered, flipping through the journal. If she just kept her mouth shut about the money, we had no choice. Tiffany's voice was cold, matter of fact. She was going to expose everything. The renovations, the clients, all of it. We'd have gone to prison. So instead we put her in the ground. Chad's laugh was bitter. God, we're fucked if Edward really has that video. Maybe we should. Tiffany stopped, looking directly at one of the hidden cameras. Edward's blood ran cold. Had she spotted it? But no, she was looking past it at something else. Chad, we can't keep doing this. First Lillian, then sending Jerome to break in, now this. If we get caught, we won't get caught. We've been careful. But Chad sounded uncertain. We just need to find that video and destroy it. Then it's our word against a dead woman's journals and Edward's grief. What if the video's not here? What if he gave it to the police already? Then Nicholson would have arrested us by now. No, Edward's keeping it close because he doesn't trust the cops to handle it right. He's probably planning some dramatic confrontation. Chad slammed a drawer shut. We need to figure out his next move. They searched for another hour before giving up. As Edward watched them leave, he felt a savage satisfaction. They confessed. Maybe not directly, not in language a prosecutor would love, but combined with everything else, the financial fraud, Damon's phone call, Lillian's evidence, it painted a complete picture. On Monday morning, Edward walked into Detective Nicholson's office with a hard drive containing every recording, every document, every piece of evidence he'd gathered over the past 3 months. They broke into my house on Saturday night, Edward said without preamble. They confessed to Lillian's murder. It's all on here. Nicholson reviewed the footage, and Edward watched the detective's expression harden. Mr. Case, some of this evidence might be inadmissible. The recordings of private conversations without consent. I know, but it's enough to get a warrant, right? Enough to investigate. And the break-in is clean. They came into my home illegally. I had security cameras running, and they said what they said. Nicholson was quiet for a long moment. The fraud case is solid. We can arrest them today on that. And with this, he tapped the screen showing Chad and Tiffany in Edward's workshop. This gives us probable cause for the murder investigation. We can get warrants, search their property, bring them in for questioning. But will it stick? I don't know, Nicholson said honestly. A good lawyer will argue the confessions were ambiguous, taken out of context. But combined with the thallium in your wife's system, her documentation, the pattern of behavior. He looked up. It's enough to try, and that's all anyone can promise. The arrests happened that afternoon. Chad and Tiffany were taken into custody at the Mansion Project site, Damon at his law office. The charges included wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and, pending further investigation, first-degree murder. Edward watched the news coverage from his living room, Perry asleep against his shoulder. His son had been asking fewer questions about Mommy lately, slowly accepting that she wasn't coming back. But he deserved to know the truth someday. Deserved to know his mother had been brave and smart and had fought to expose corruption even as she was dying. Lucas stopped by that evening with beer and takeout. It's all over the news. The DA is calling it one of the most complex fraud cases in the city's history. That's not why I did it. I know, but the fraud is what's going to put them away for sure. The murder charge. Lucas hesitated. Nicholson told me they're building the case, but it's still circumstantial. Edward had expected this. The legal system required proof beyond reasonable doubt, and he'd known from the beginning that might be impossible to achieve. But he'd done everything he could. The truth is out there now, he said quietly. Everyone knows what they did. Even if the murder charge doesn't stick, they're going to prison for years on the fraud. Their lives are destroyed. Their reputations are ruined. They'll never hurt anyone else. Is that enough? Edward looked down at Perry, thinking of Lillian's letter. Make them pay. He had. Maybe not in the exact way the justice system preferred, but he'd exposed them, trapped them, destroyed everything they'd built on lies and theft and murder. "It's what I could do," he finally said. "And it's more than they left Lillian." The trial took 8 months to prepare. The fraud case went first. It was cleaner, easier to prove. The evidence Edward and Lucas had gathered on the Hartwell project, combined with Lillian's documentation of the previous schemes and additional victims who came forward once the story broke, was overwhelming. Chad, Tiffany, and Damon were convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and embezzlement. They each faced 15 to 20 years in federal prison. The murder trial was more complicated. The prosecution built its case carefully. Lillian's documented suspicions, the thallium found in her hair samples, the hidden evidence showing she'd been investigating them, the recorded conversations revealing their knowledge of her death and their efforts to cover it up. The defense argued that Lillian had been sick with a documented autoimmune disease, that thallium could come from environmental sources, that the defendant's recorded words had been taken out of context. They painted her as a paranoid woman whose illness had caused illusions, and Chad and Tiffany as innocent business people being persecuted by a grieving husband who couldn't accept his wife's natural death. Edward sat through every day of testimony, listening to them try to destroy Lillian's reputation to save themselves. It was almost worse than the murder itself. But the prosecution had one more piece of evidence, something Edward had held back until the perfect moment. Buried in Lillian's journals was a detail the defense couldn't explain away. She documented finding a small bottle of ant poison in their trash after one of the dinners at Chad and Tiffany's house. She'd thought it was odd at the time, but hadn't connected it to her illness until later. She'd retrieved the bottle from the trash and hidden it with her other evidence. The bottle was tested. It contained thallium sulfate, a form of poison that had been banned for consumer use decades ago, but that could still be obtained through certain industrial suppliers, including, the prosecution demonstrated, a pest control company owned by Tiffany's uncle, the same uncle who'd employed Jerome Wilder before his arrest for breaking into Edward's workshop. The connections were intricate, the evidence circumstantial, but together they formed a web that was hard to escape. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned with the verdict, Edward held his breath. Guilty. First-degree murder. Both Chad and Tiffany. Damon was convicted as an accessory after the fact for helping cover up the crime and attempting to destroy evidence. The sentences were handed down a month later. Chad and Tiffany each received life in prison without possibility of parole to run consecutively with their fraud sentences. Damon got 25 years. Edward stood outside the courthouse afterward, Lucas beside him, feeling something he hadn't felt in almost 2 years, peace. "You did it," Lucas said quietly. "Lillian would be proud. I had help." Edward clasped his friend's shoulder. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. What are you going to do now?" Edward looked up at the sky, thinking of all the nights he'd spent in his workshop, planning and plotting and building his trap piece by piece. Thinking of Lillian's letter, her faith that he'd know what to do. Thinking of Perry, who deserved a father who was present and whole, not consumed by revenge. "I'm going to take Perry to the beach," he said. "He's never seen the ocean. Lillian always wanted to take him, but we never got around to it." He felt tears prick his eyes. "And then I'm going to come home and build things again. Real things for real clients. I'm going to be his dad and honor his mom's memory by living the kind of life she'd want for us." "Sounds good, Ed. Sounds really good." That night, Edward sat in Perry's room as his son fell asleep. The boy's grip on his hand was tight, the way it had been every night since Lillian died. "Daddy." Perry's voice was drowsy. "Did the bad people get punished?" Edward had told him a simplified version of events, age-appropriate but honest. Perry deserved to know his mother hadn't just died. She'd been taken from them, and that justice, however long it took, had been served. "Yeah, buddy, they got punished." "Good." Perry yawned. "Mommy would be happy. I think she would be." As Perry drifted off, Edward thought he felt something, a warmth, a presence, a sense of approval that might have been his imagination, but felt real nonetheless. "I did what you asked," he thought. "I made them pay. And now I'm going to make sure Perry grows up knowing you were a hero. That you fought for what was right even when you were scared and sick and dying." that you were the bravest person I ever knew." The wind chimed outside the window, and Edward chose to believe it was her answer. Later, in his workshop, Edward stood before his workbench and picked up his tools. The wood was cherry, aged and beautiful. He had a commission for a hope chest, a traditional piece meant to hold precious things for future generations. He thought about what he'd learned over the past 2 years, how patience could be a weapon, how careful planning could bring down people who thought themselves untouchable, how love could drive someone to extraordinary lengths, both for good and ill. Chad and Tiffany had loved money more than morality. Damon had loved his own cleverness more than justice, and their loves had destroyed them. Edward had loved Lillian, loved Perry, loved the truth, and his love had been stronger. He began to work, his hands steady and sure, creating something beautiful from raw materials. It was what he did. It was who he was. And unlike the lies and schemes of people like Chad and Tiffany, what Edward built would last. The hope chest took shape slowly, each joint precise, each detail considered. When it was finished weeks later, Edward added a small inscription inside the lid, where only the owner would see it. "For the things worth keeping. Built with love by Edward Case, in memory of Lillian Case, who taught me that the truth always surfaces and justice may take time, but it's worth the wait." He delivered it to his client, accepted their thanks, and drove home to have dinner with his son. Perry had mac and cheese. Edward had peace. And somewhere, he hoped, Lillian was smiling. 5 years after Lillian's death, Edward stood in the same mansion where he'd trapped his wife's killers. But this time, he was here for real work. A couple from Chicago had purchased the property and wanted the full artisan treatment. His custom furniture throughout, built-ins in the library, a custom dining table that would seat 12. It was the kind of project that should have been tainted by memory, but Edward found it wasn't. He'd transformed this place from a symbol of his elaborate deception into honest work, and that felt right. Lucas was the general contractor, as he'd been on so many projects since. They worked together easily, their friendship forged stronger by everything they'd been through. "Remember when we were here 5 years ago, setting up cameras and planning the trap?" Lucas asked one afternoon as they measured for built-in bookcases. "Every day," Edward admitted, "but it doesn't hurt anymore. It just is." Perry was 11 now, smart and curious, showing early signs of his mother's sharp mind and his father's steady hands. He sometimes came to job sites after school, watching Edward work, asking questions about joints and grain and why certain woods were better for certain purposes. "Is this where you caught the bad people?" Perry had asked the first time Edward brought him here. "Yeah, buddy, this is where it happened." "Cool." Perry had examined the space with interest. "Can you teach me how to make secret camera hiding spots? How about I teach you woodworking instead, and we leave the detective work to detectives?" "Deal." The case had made national news for a while. A grieving husband's elaborate sting operation, the murdered wife who'd left evidence from beyond the grave, the wealthy criminals brought down by their own arrogance. True crime podcasts had covered it. A streaming documentary was in development, though Edward had refused to participate. He didn't need fame. He'd never wanted it. He just wanted justice. Chad had died in prison 2 years into his sentence. A heart attack at 42, brought on by stress and poor health. Edward had felt nothing when he heard. Not satisfaction, not grief, just a distant acknowledgement that one chapter was completely closed. Tiffany was still serving her life sentence, reportedly spending her days maintaining her innocence to anyone who would listen. Edward didn't think about her often. She was where she belonged, and that was enough. Damon was eligible for parole in another 15 years. Edward suspected he'd spend that time being exactly what he'd always been, a clever lawyer looking for angles, trying to find a way out. But the evidence had been too solid, the pattern too clear. He wasn't going anywhere. Jerome Wilder, the cousin who'd broken into Edward's workshop, had taken a plea deal and served 3 years. He was out now, reportedly working at a warehouse and staying clean. Edward had no ill will toward him. Jerome had been a pawn, someone else's tool. The people who'd wielded him had paid the real price. As Edward worked on the mansion, creating beauty in the same space where he'd orchestrated justice, he thought about how life had unfolded. Perry was thriving. Edward's business had grown, his reputation for quality craftsmanship bringing in clients from across the country. He'd even started dating again. Carefully, slowly, never trying to replace Lillian, but opening himself to the possibility of companionship. Her parents were still in his and Perry's lives, grateful that Edward had fought for their daughter's memory. They visited often, helping raise their grandson and keeping Lillian's spirit alive through stories and photos and love. Detective Nicholson had retired but stayed in touch. He'd bent some rules for Edward during the investigation, looked the other way on evidence that might have been questionably obtained, because he believed in the cause. They had coffee every few months, never talking about the case, just two men who'd worked together toward justice and came out the other side with mutual respect. On the 5-year anniversary of Lillian's death, Edward took Perry to her grave. They brought flowers, lavender, her favorite. Perry was old enough now to remember her clearly, to miss her actively rather than just feeling the absence. "Do you think she knows we got them?" Perry asked, tracing her name on the headstone. "I think she knows," Edward said, "and I think she's proud of how strong you've been." "Dad," Perry looked up, "when I'm older, will you tell me everything? The whole story, when you're ready?" "It's not a light story, Perry. It's about hard choices and moral gray areas, and doing things that might not be legal, but felt necessary for justice. I still want to know. She was my mom. I want to know what she did and what you did for her." Edward pulled his son close. "Okay, when you're ready, I'll tell you everything." As they walked back to the car, Perry said, "I think I want to be like you when I grow up. A woodworker, someone who builds things that last, and someone who doesn't let bad people win." Perry's voice was firm, so much like Lillian's when she'd made up her mind about something. Someone who fights for what's right, even when it's hard. Edward felt his throat tighten with pride and love and the bittersweet ache of Lillian not being here to see the amazing person their son was becoming. "You're already on your way, buddy. You're already on your way." That night, alone in his workshop, Edward opened the old document bag he'd kept from Lillian's closet. Her letter was still there, creased from being read dozens of times. He unfolded it once more, reading her words in the quiet. Make them pay. He had. He'd done everything she'd asked and more. And in the process, he'd learned something profound. Revenge, when it's actually justice, doesn't hollow you out. It can heal. It can restore balance. It can honor the dead while protecting the living. Edward folded the letter carefully and put it back. Someday, when Perry was old enough, he'd give it to him. Let him read his mother's final words, understand her courage and intelligence and fierce love. But for now, Edward would keep it safe, the way he kept all precious things. He turned on the workshop lights and approached his current project, a cradle for Lucas and his wife's first child, due in 3 months. The wood was maple, smooth and pale, perfect for new beginnings. As Edward worked, he thought about cycles, death and birth, grief and healing, justice delayed but not denied. The way good things could grow from terrible losses if you were patient enough, strong enough to see it through. The chisel moved through the wood with practiced ease, shaping, refining, creating something that would hold something precious. It was meditative work, the kind that let his mind wander while his hands stayed sure. He thought about Lillian less painfully now, remembered her laugh, her passion for design, the way she'd organized their lives with such loving precision. How she'd been smart enough to see the pattern of fraud, brave enough to investigate it, and clever enough to leave evidence where it would eventually be found. She'd known he would figure it out, known he would follow through, known he would be strong enough to do what needed doing. And he had been, because she believed in him, and because Perry needed him to be. That was enough. That would always be enough. As the night deepened and the cradle took shape, Edward felt something he hadn't felt in years. Simple contentment. The work was good. His son was safe. Justice had been served. The rest was just living, one day at a time, building things that mattered and teaching Perry to do the same. Outside, the wind chimed through the trees, a sound like approval, like peace, like a mother watching over her family for wherever good souls go when their work on earth is done. Edward smiled and kept working, his hands steady, his purpose clear, his heart finally, blessedly at rest. this is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.